Chapter 16. The Demon's Pit. The dwarf smiths worked non-stop for days, forging the lengthy chain that would be used to lower Eadril into the pit. Meanwhile, engineers ventured down into the prison chamber to construct the massive winch and pulley system that would control the movement of the chain. Finally, the day came when all was ready to put Eadril's bold plan into action. 20 heavily armed dwarf warriors escorted Eadril and Errol into the black depths of the mountain. Doran insisted on going with them. "You have already been generous enough, Your Majesty," Eadril said to Doran as the two walked down the gloomy corridor. "I never intended for you to place yourself in such danger. The last time we walked down this path together, it was to aid me in my darkest hour," Doran said. "I will not let you walk alone now as you face yours." A chill went through Errol as they entered the damp underground tunnel that led to Diobor's prison. He remembered all too well what he had seen the last time he had been in that place. The prince braced himself to hear the horrible scream of the demon at any moment. But no such noise came. All was silent except for the splashing of the party as it made its way down the river of death. The foul, stagnant water remained, but the bodies of the dwarf warriors that had been butchered by the demon had been carried away and given a proper burial in the tombs beside their kinsmen. Finally, they came to the vast circular room that contained the demon's pit. Much to the relief of all, the heavy stone lid was still in place. However, each person felt the weight of the grim reality that they would soon be removing it. The newest addition to the room was the impressive winch and pulley system that the dwarf engineers had constructed to lower Eadril into the pit. Several hundred yards of specially forged thin but exceedingly strong chain were wrapped around the spool. Whether or not the length would be sufficient remained to be seen. "Are you sure you want to do this?" Doran asked Eadril as his eyes, along with those of everyone else, were fixed upon the lid that covered the pit. "This is our only hope," Eadril said gravely. "Raise the lid." The engineers immediately responded and began raising the stone that covered the pit. The chain strained and creaked as the dwarves turned the crank to pull the heavy stone off the pit. After a few minutes of such effort, the lid was suspended at a sufficient height above the well. When the engineers finished their work, silence reigned in the room. All eyes were on the black hole in the center of the chamber. An eternity seemed to pass before Eadril finally said, "Let us begin." The engineers started by rigging Eadril in a leather harness. The end of the chain was then secured to the harness. The pulley system was designed with a swing arm that was moved into position over the center of the pit. The series of pulleys on the armature would allow Eadril to be lowered and raised at a quicker pace and with less effort. Eadril hung from the swing arm in the center of the pit with a torch in one hand and his other hand gripping the chain. A lantern was secured to the chain as well, to provide additional light and serve as a beacon to guide the commander back to his point of escape once he started exploring the depths below. With a nod from Eadril, the engineers began to release the chain and sent the commander on his downward course. "Good luck," Errol said to his friend. "He will need it," Doran muttered. Slowly, Eadril descended into the dark depths of the well. The light from the torch danced on the walls of the pit around him, but the area below remained a black mystery. The only noise he heard was the rattling of the chain as the engineers let out foot after foot in a steady rhythm. Eadril began to worry that perhaps they were making too much noise. But it was too late to fret over such things. He had no intention of turning back. Errol gazed over the edge of the pit and watched as the glow from Eadril's torch and the lantern grew fainter and fainter. His heart sank as the darkness of the well finally swallowed the light altogether. And as it did, the prince could not help but wonder if he would ever see his friend again. Minutes passed by, and yard after yard of chain was sent into the pit. The engineers cast wary glances at one another as the remaining quantity on the spool dwindled. Doran spoke what was on everyone's mind. "The chain has almost run out, and still he has not reached the bottom, if indeed there is a bottom." "As long as there is still chain left, there is hope," Errol said. Suddenly the chain began to shake. Errol's heart leapt in anticipation. "That is the signal," Errol said in an excited voice. "He has reached the bottom." Adriel was greatly relieved when his feet finally touched solid ground. Next to encountering the demon, his greatest fear was that he would find deep water at the bottom of the well. Though the air was damp and the stones upon which he stood were somewhat slimy, the water that had once flowed down the well had long since seeped away to still darker depths. He gazed up at the heights from whence he had just descended. Beyond the sphere of the light emitted by his torch and lantern, the blackness appeared infinite. Never had he felt so alone. But he was not afraid. Few warriors would have dared to brave the demon's pit, but such was Adriel's courage that he pressed on in his quest, determined to find the sword of the Demonslayer. Adriel held out his torch and slowly turned in a complete circle to survey his immediate surroundings. He soon concluded that he was in a very large cave. In Ardrian's day, it had probably been an underground lake. It would not be easy to find the sword in such a vast, dark area. Adriel was intent on exploring every inch of the cavern floor. Using the lantern on the chain as a reference point, he set off on a spiral path. He walked in wider and wider circles around the beacon. He kept his eyes fixed on the ground, looking up only occasionally to see where he was in relation to his starting point. After a while, his meticulous search brought him to the outer fringe of the cave. There, stalagmites rose from the floor like giant pillars. Adriel wove his way through the stone outcroppings as he traced the curved arc of the cavern wall. In addition to scanning the floor, he looked for any passages that might have led to other chambers. After walking nearly halfway around the cave, he came upon such an opening. The commander stood before a gaping arched portal. The opening was large enough to fit a small house through. Adriel stepped forward and extended the torch inside. A wide, towering corridor spanned out before him, as far as his torchlight would allow him to see. Adriel felt extremely uneasy as he stood before the entrance to the passage. He could feel a great evil emanating from the darkness before him. He turned away to complete his search of the cavern's outer wall. He prayed that he would find what he was looking for there and be spared from having to venture down that path of dread. Adriel had nearly completed his circuit of the cavern when his eyes spied a glimmer on the floor before him. His heart raced in anticipation as he rushed toward the shining object. He stopped in his tracks as he took in the sight before him. He had found the sword. Adriel carefully picked up the legendary weapon and pulled the sword from its scabbard. The commander gazed in awe at the sword as he held it out before him. The hilt was shaped like the wings of a dove. The blade, still razor-sharp and unblemished, shimmered with a holy light. Adriel could have gone on admiring the sword for some time longer if a sudden noise had not reminded him of his perilous position. An all-too-familiar scream came from the dreaded passage, and a powerful blast of air rushed into the chamber. Deobor was awake, and he was on his way. Adriel raced toward the beacon in the center of the cavern. He secured the scabbard around his waist and then climbed into the harness. Holding the sword in one hand, he grabbed the chain in his other and shook it violently from side to side to signal that he was ready to be pulled up. "Come on, come on," Adriel muttered impatiently under his breath. A second and louder scream echoed in the chamber. The shocking sound caused Adriel to stop shaking the chain for a moment as he turned and looked in the direction of the passage. Adriel then shook with all his might as he saw two red eyes appear in the distant darkness. Errol and Doran exchanged terrified glances as the demon's cry rose from the well and reverberated throughout the circular room. The engineers and dwarf warriors stood frozen in fear. "Man the winch," Doran commanded. The king's words roused the engineers from their trance. They immediately scrambled to secure the controls of the machine. "Wait for the signal before you start turning," Errol called out. The chain started to move a little at first, then suddenly more violently. "Do you suppose he is ready?" Doran asked Errol. "I am not sure," Errol answered. "He could be trying to secure the harness. If we start too quickly, we could pull the chain up before he is ready." A second, louder cry rose up from the well. The chain stopped shaking for a moment. It then started to shake violently again. "Start turning," Errol ordered. Adriel felt a sudden tug and then immediately he was pulled from the floor. He ascended into the dark heights at a fast, steady pace. Though the engineers were cranking at a furious rate, no amount of haste seemed sufficient to Eadril in his precarious position. A third cry rang out, and this one seemed to come from the very bottom of the well. A blast of air rushed up and engulfed Eadril. The foul wind buffeted the dangling knight. If not for the harness, he would have been hard-pressed to remain secured to the chain. Eadril looked up and saw a circle of light above him. He then glanced down and suddenly saw two small red lights in the depths below him. The demon was ascending. Just as Eadril reached the top of the well, the demon seized him. Errol and Doran jumped back as Diobor and Eadril suddenly emerged from the pit. The demon tore Eadril out of the harness and threw him across the room. As Eadril violently collided with the wall, he lost hold of the demon's bane. The weapon slid across the floor, well out of his reach. The four-armed demon stood at the edge of the pit and let out a terrible battle cry. Two of its hands held large swords. Its other two fists were clenched like powerful warhammers. As a testament to the courage of their race, the dwarf warriors sprang forward to confront the monster. Refusing to quake beneath the demon's crimson glare, the dwarves charged in with battle axes raised. But the mountain folk's martial prowess, impressive as it was, could not hold up against the supernatural strength of the demon. Diobor swatted the dwarves aside as if they were merely flies. The broken and battered bodies of the dwarf warriors were flung to all sides of the room. An unfortunate few were cast headlong into the abysmal depths of the well. But the valiant charge of the dwarves was not in vain. While the dwarf warriors occupied Diobor's attention, Errol raced forward and grabbed the demon's bane. The young elf felt a surge of power course through him as he held the holy weapon. Diobor sensed the impending danger, but it was too late. The demon turned and saw the descendant of Ordrian standing before him. With lightning quickness, the young knight thrust the shimmering blade forward and into the demon's chest. Diobor howled in agony as he felt the fatal blow. Ghostly hands sprang up from the floor and seized the demon. Diobor struggled vainly in their clinging grasp as they dragged him from the realm of the living and into the unseen depths of hell. In a matter of moments, it was all over and silence reigned in the room. Eadril had risen to his feet in time to see Errol's remarkable feat. "Congratulations, my friend," Eadril said as he approached Errol. "You are now a demon slayer." Errol's chest was still heaving, and his face was still flushed from the exhilaration of the moment. He could scarcely believe what he had just done. "Is it over then?" Errol asked in disbelief. "Yes, for Diobor, it is over," Eadril answered. "However, there is still Diaxes to deal with." Errol handed the sword out for Eadril to take. "Then you will be needing this," Errol said to Eadril. "No," Eadril said. "I think that it would be best if you kept the sword." "Are you sure?" Errol asked. "If I am meant to have the sword, then it will find its way into my hands when the time is right," Eadril replied. "The same goes for anyone else who might be destined to wield it. But for now, it is under your protection, and it could very well be that you may need to use it again."